I only needed somewhere to sleep. But this old forge already knew my family.
She was 19 and homeless. No room, no family key, no bank card she could use. Just an old canvas backpack and $5 her father had folded behind her driver's license. And with that $5, she bought an abandoned copper apple butter kettle forge outside Lancaster, in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Forgotten since 1978. Half the roof sagged over the rear workroom. The brick chimney had split above the flashing. The county condemned the forge in March 2021 and scheduled demolition for the coming autumn. But inside a massive oak hammering stump stood a sealed hollow no inspector had opened in decades, holding money, tools, and a message meant for someone willing to strike metal patiently enough to listen. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Maeve Hollis had been enduring her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she learned to move quietly through rooms where adults were tired. She could tell from the way a cupboard door closed whether supper would be peaceful, and from the sound of her father's boots on the porch whether he had brought home good news or another bill. She kept broken pencils until they were too short to sharpen and saved string in a tobacco tin because useful things, her father said, deserved another chance. Patrick Hollis repaired farm machinery outside Lititz and came home smelling of diesel, cold iron, and the orange soap mechanics used to scour grease from their knuckles. He was not a man who explained affection. He left the warmest biscuit for Maeve, checked the oil in her old Buick without telling her, and stood in her bedroom doorway on winter mornings until he heard her breathing evenly. The person who taught Maeve patience was Patrick's uncle, Elias Hollis. Every other Saturday, from the time Maeve was 9 until she was 14, Patrick drove her to Elias's narrow coppersmith shop behind a white farmhouse near Bird in Hand. Elias had one clouded eye, suspenders repaired with fishing line, and forearms stippled with pale scars from sparks and hot metal. He made small kettles, ladles, flashing pieces, and occasionally repaired the immense copper kettles Pennsylvania Dutch families still used for apple butter. Maeve was never allowed to begin with a hammer. First she swept, then she sorted rivets. Then she held the edge of a copper sheet while Elias marked circles with a Dremel point. She watched him heat copper until its surface dulled toward a dark cherry glow, then quench it so the metal softened beneath the hammer rather than tearing. She listened to the changing note of each blow against the wooden stake. On Sundays, when an apple butter kettle came in for repair, Elias let her polish one hand-sized patch with pumice until her own face appeared in the metal. He told her, "Never punish metal for refusing your first idea." Maeve understood only years later. Elias never struck harder when copper resisted. He annealed it, changed the angle, and began again. He died during a wet April when Maeve was 14. By the time Patrick took her back to the property, Elias's shop had already been emptied by relatives settling the estate. The raising hammers were gone, so were the stakes, patterns, copper scraps, and the black notebook he kept wrapped in oilcloth above his bench. Maeve found only a crescent of copper scale beneath the old stump and carried it home in her coat pocket. Her father remarried 3 years later. Lenora entered the Hollis house without raising her voice and somehow made every room feel supervised. She arranged pantry labels outward, counted towels before laundry day, and kept household receipts clipped by month in perfect envelopes. Nothing was openly forbidden. Things simply became unavailable. Patrick's tools moved from the mudroom to a locked cabinet. Maeve's mail appeared already stacked on Lenora's desk. Questions were answered with pauses long enough to make asking twice feel improper. When Patrick became ill, Lenora controlled appointments, passwords, bills, and eventually the visitors allowed through the front door. Maeve still sat beside her father at night, rubbing lotion into the dry skin across his knuckles while the oxygen machine breathed beside them. Patrick died on October 6th, 2022. 3 days later, Maeve came downstairs carrying one of his flannel shirts. Her canvas backpack sat in the yard. The sight of it through the storm door glass stopped her before Lenora spoke. One shoulder strap lay twisted in wet grass. Maeve opened the front door and saw that the side pocket had been left unzipped. Her toothbrush, 2 shirts, socks, and an old photograph were packed inside with the neatness of a hotel drawer. Lenora stood behind her holding Patrick's brass keyring. "The house is mine. You need to leave." 8 words. Maeve looked toward the kitchen table. Her father's second wife did not look away, did not apologize, and did not explain. She simply pressed the lock button on Patrick's key fob. Somewhere beside the garage, Maeve's Buick gave a small, obedient chirp. The bank card failed before noon. Maeve tried it at a gas station on Oregon Pike for a bottle of water and a packet of crackers. Declined appeared in hard black letters. She opened her wallet. $5. Her father had slipped the bill behind her license months before, perhaps years. She could not remember when. For 6 weeks she moved east and south through Lancaster County as autumn hardened. The first nights she slept upright in Lancaster's Amtrak station until an employee told her the building could not be used as a shelter. She spent 2 nights beneath the covered section of a parking garage near Queen Street, waking whenever tires hissed on the wet concrete. In Columbia, she found an unlocked church vestibule and slept with her backpack strap looped twice around her wrist. She did not spend the $5. A bakery employee named Ruth handed her a paper bag of yesterday's rolls after seeing her count coins she did not have. A bus driver let her ride 1 stop past her fare. At the Lancaster Public Library, she learned which restroom opened first and which radiator beside the history shelves stayed warmest. She washed at the sink, dried her sleeves beneath the hand dryer, and read newspapers until hunger stopped making the words move. Her money became $4.36 after a cup of soup, then $3.81, then $2.12. She began keeping the original $5 bill folded separately and spending coins collected from jacket pockets, sidewalks, and the bottoms of vending machines whenever she could. It was foolish bookkeeping, but the bill had passed through her father's hands. That mattered. On a November afternoon, gold rain darkened the library windows while Maeve searched the public classifieds terminal for room rentals she could not afford. One listing had no photograph. County Surplus Structure Forge Shop. Lancaster County. Hazardous condition. Boyer assumes all light law picture Minimum transfer, $5. Maeve read it once. Then again. At the bottom was an address near a rural road east of Lancaster, and a note that the building had formerly been registered as Hollis, Copper Kettle Works. Her fingers stopped on the keyboard. Hollis. She enlarged the scanned county image until the pixels blurred. A low workshop leaned beneath walnut trees, its windows black, Vone brick chimney rising crooked from the roof. Over the doorway hung the faint remains of a long wooden sign. Maeve touched the copper crescent she had carried for 5 years in the smallest pocket of her backpack. The county office closed at 4:30. She checked the clock. Then she took the $5 bill from behind her license, smoothed the fold her father had made, and walked out into the rain. By sunset, Maeve was heading toward the only property in Lancaster County that seemed to remember her name. The bus carried Maeve east beneath a sky the colour of old tin, past harvested cornfields and white farmhouses set back from the road behind windbreaks of spruce. She rode as far as the route allowed, then walked. The county office was not near the property, and the property was not near anything convenient. By late afternoon she had covered a little more than 9 miles on foot, her canvas backpack rubbing a raw place beneath one shoulder. When darkness came, she found an open-sided hay barn beyond Leacock, and slept beneath loose straw without asking permission. The temperature dropped to 34 degrees. She folded Patrick's flannel shirt beneath her cheek and tucked both hands inside the sleeves of her coat. Mice moved somewhere in the stacked bales. Once, near midnight, a horse coughed in a neighbouring field. At first light, she started walking again. By 8:30 she reached a small crossroads district where the useful places seemed arranged by habit rather than planning. Miller's Hardware beneath a faded green awning, Stoltzfus Feed and Grain with seed signs nailed to the wall, the Dutch Pantry Cafe breathing bacon steam onto the windows, Rife's Shoe Repair beside a narrow alley, and Weaver's Market with crates of late apples stacked under burlap. Maeve stood across from the cafe long enough to smell coffee. Then she kept walking. The Lancaster County Satellite Records Office occupied the ground floor of an old brick municipal building with 2 flagpoles and a concrete ramp polished pale by decades of shoes. Inside, the air smelled of paper, radiator heat, and floor wax. A woman behind the counter looked up over half-moon glasses. She had silver hair gathered in a bun so exact that not one strand appeared to have negotiated its own terms. A narrow brass nameplate sat beside her blotter. MRS. Eleanor Wentz. Maeve placed the printed listing on the counter. Mrs. Wentz looked at the page, then at Maeve's coat, damp shoes, and backpack. The clerk removed her glasses. Mrs. Wentz watched her for another second. Then she stood. The deed packet was thicker than Maeve expected. There were liability waivers, boundary notes, a demolition hold, environmental language concerning old metals and fuel residue, and 3 places where Maeve had to initial beside warnings printed in capital letters. At the final page, Mrs. Wentz pointed to the transfer price. $5.00. Maeve unfolded the bill. For a moment, neither woman moved. Patrick's crease remained across George Washington's face. Mrs. Wentz accepted the money with both hands, as though $5 could become solemn if handled carefully enough. She placed the deed beneath a heavy brass stamp and pulled the lever. The machine struck once. The sound carried through the office. There, she said. Maeve looked at the stamped page. Her name stood where owner had been left blank. Mrs. Wentz opened a county road map and marked a route with a red pencil. Old Philadelphia Pike east, turn south after the covered bridge road, then take Meadow Lane past the second dairy. The paved section ends. you will see 2 mailboxes leaning toward each other. Walk another half-mile. The forge is behind the walnut line. Maeve folded the map. Mrs. Wentz had begun placing the forms into an envelope when she stopped. The clerk's fingers rested against the paper. Hollis. Maeve waited. Mrs. Wentz looked toward a row of old property ledgers behind her, then back. Maeve tightened one hand around the backpack strap. My great-uncle. The clerk sat down slowly. Maeve said nothing. Mrs. Wentz removed one ledger from a shelf and opened it near the middle. The forge was listed under Hollis ownership for most of the 20th century. Not Elias himself, older branch of the family. Jeremiah Hollis, then Samuel, then a woman named Ruth Hollis Mercer for a while. She turned a page. Maeve looked up. Mrs. Wentz traced a line with one finger. He never claimed it. Said it was not his place to. The room seemed suddenly warmer. Mrs. Wentz closed the ledger, but the last time he came, he asked me to call him if anyone named Hollis ever tried to buy it. Maeve looked at the date written in the margin. 1997. The clerk's expression changed only slightly. Maeve nodded. Mrs. Wentz slipped the deed into the envelope. Maeve looked confused. Your $5 bill. It will sit in my drawer with the receipt copy until reconciliation. The idea of it staying there seemed strangely comforting. Mrs. Wentz handed her the envelope. And find dry bedding before dark. Maeve almost smiled. By noon she had passed beyond the businesses and sidewalks. Traffic thinned along Old Philadelphia Pike, giving way to farm wagons, delivery vans, and long stretches where fields lay open under the November wind. She followed the clerk's red marks until the road narrowed and the shoulders disappeared. Near the second dairy, an elderly man in blue coveralls stood beside a mailbox sorting circulars. He watched Maeve approach. The old Hollis forge. His face changed in a way she was beginning to recognize. Bought it? The man gave one slow nod. A black and white dog came from behind the barn, barked once, then circled Maeve at a respectful distance. That is Amos, the man said. He distrusts umbrellas and tax assessors. Maeve glanced at the empty sky. He pointed down the lane. Walnuts start where the ditch bends. Building sits back farther than it looks. The dog followed her 20 yards before the man whistled him home. The walnut trees appeared first. Their bare branches crossed above the lane like black joints against the pale sky. Fallen husks had turned the roadside dark where tires crushed them. Then Maeve saw the roof. The forge was larger than the photograph had suggested. It measured perhaps 30 feet across the front and nearly 50 deep, built of rough fieldstone below and weathered timber framing above. The rear roofline had settled visibly, its slate interrupted by patches of corrugated metal. A brick chimney rose from the west side, cracked near the crown. The old sign hung beneath the eaves. Only part of the final S remained. Maeve stopped at the gate. No music came from nearby houses. No traffic passed. The building waited in a silence so complete that she could hear walnut leaves scraping along the lane behind her. The front door had swollen inside its frame. She shouldered it once. Nothing. Twice. The wood released with a low tearing sound, and a smell came out that was unlike any room Maeve had entered before. Sawdust, wet stone, mouse nests. And beneath them, unmistakable even after all those years, the metallic bitterness of old copper. She stepped inside. Light entered through 2 grimy windows and broke across a front room scattered with warped shelves and benches. Her shoes pressed grit into the floorboards. Somewhere overhead, a loose piece of tin clicked softly with the wind. She ran one finger along a work table. Green residue streaked her skin. Patina. On the far wall, a broken-handled raising hammer rested where someone had left it, the head dark with age. Maeve picked it up. The weight was wrong without the missing length of ash handle, but the shape of the head was familiar. Elias had owned one like it. She put it down carefully. The back room opened through a wide doorway. Here the roof sag was clearer. One ceiling beam had bowed enough to separate plaster from the lath. Rain had darkened a corner of the stone wall. A rusted iron annealing hearth occupied one side beneath the chimney, and beside it lay sheets of copper so heavily oxidized that they looked almost turquoise. Then she saw the kettle. It stood overturned near the center of the room. Nearly 5 feet across, Maeve crouched beside it and rubbed the rim with her sleeve. Under soot, dirt, and green corrosion, a thin line of red metal appeared. Copper. A kettle that size would once have held close to 50 gallons, large enough for families to cook apple butter outdoors through the night while someone stirred continuously with a long wooden paddle. She tapped the side. The sound rolled through the room like a low bell. Maeve sat back on her heels. For the first time since October, she owned something too heavy for anyone to throw into a yard. She spent the remaining daylight checking what could be secured. The back door still latched. 2 windows had intact glass. The old hand pump outside gave nothing but a hollow squeal. She found an outhouse leaning beyond a stand of sumac, then returned before dark with an armful of dry leaves and old burlap she had shaken clean beneath the eaves. There was no electricity. When night came, the forge disappeared around her. Maeve lay on the front room floor with her backpack beneath her head and Patrick's flannel shirt pulled across her chest. Cold rose through the boards. The building made sounds she did not yet understand. A small knock inside the wall. The settling complaint of timber. A branch brushing slate. Once, something moved beneath the floor and stopped when she lifted her head. She remained awake a long time. Through the nearest window she could see one walnut branch moving against the stars. On the workbench beside her sat the broken raising hammer. In the darkness, Maeve could almost remember Elias listening to copper before choosing where to strike. Every hammer mark remembers the hand that made it. By daylight, Maeve began with water. The hand pump stood 20 paces behind the forge beneath a rusted cap of galvanized steel. She removed the leather from an old bucket handle, wrapped it around the pump rod for grip, and worked the handle until her shoulder ached. For 10 minutes, nothing came but air. Then brown water coughed from the spout. Maeve pumped until it cleared. She did not drink it. She filled a dented pail for washing and marked the well on the back of an old county envelope with one word, test. The outhouse required less optimism. Its roof leaked, the seat board had split, and one hinge was held by fencing wire. She swept out leaves, wedged the door square with a piece of slate, and decided that survival sometimes meant repairing the least dignified thing first. By the 3rd day, she knew the forge by sound. The 3rd board inside the front door squeaked sharply. 2 boards beside the workbench answered with a lower groan. The floor near the chimney gave one dry click whenever she crossed it after sunset, as though heat from the day had tightened an old nail. She began stepping around these sounds without meaning to. On the 4th morning she walked back toward the crossroads. Miller's hardware smelled of linseed oil, rope, fertilizer, and the faint mineral dust of a building that had sold nails for longer than anyone remembered. Drawers with handwritten labels covered one wall. Washers hung in divided tins. A brass bell above the door rang once when Maeve entered. The owner looked up from sharpening a mower blade. Walter Miller had eyebrows like two grey paintbrushes and a left thumb flattened permanently at the nail. Maeve stopped. Mrs. Wentz talks fast. Mrs. Wentz talks accurately. He wiped the blade with a rag. You need something. Walter considered that. Maeve took out the folded deed and laid it on the counter, as though ownership might serve where money could not. I know. He looked at her boots, then at the list she had written on the back of a library printout. Maeve emptied her pocket. $1.12. Walter did not smile. Maeve looked at him. He pulled a narrow ledger from beneath the counter. He wrote it down. $15. When you reach 15, you stop buying. I was not planning to. From beneath a stack of seed catalogues, he produced a stained paperback titled Farm and Home Repairs, Roofs, Masonry, Wells, Flues. Old edition, he said. Better drawings. Maeve left with a chimney brush, a spool of stove wire, 2 pounds of sixpenny nails, a box of wooden matches, and a small sack of furnace cement. Walter wrote the prices in pencil. Chimney brush, $4,755 stove wire, $20 nails, 145 matches, 35 cents, furnace cement, $3.40. He drew one line beneath the total. Maeve carried everything home. The chimney took the rest of that day and most of the next. She began from below because Walter's manual agreed with Mrs. Wentz about roofs. Maeve removed the rusted stovepipe collar, tied the round chimney brush to sections of scavenged iron rod, and pushed upward a foot at a time. The first pull released a black sheet of soot. The second brought down creosote in brittle scales thick as bark. She covered her hair with Patrick's old shirt and worked the brush up and down until her shoulders burned, rotating it at every joint where the flue narrowed. After 2 hours, the floor looked as though someone had emptied a coal sack across it. She filled 3 buckets. The upper obstruction would not move. Maeve fed a length of stove wire through the brush eye, added weight with 2 old nuts, and worked it against the blockage without striking hard enough to damage the flue tile. Something broke loose at 3 in the afternoon. A dead starling's nest fell into the hearth with a shower of twigs, feathers, walnut husks, and black dust. Maeve sat on the floor coughing into her sleeve. Then she laughed once. It was the first sound like that the building had heard from her. She cleaned until nearly dark, 7 hours altogether. At the cracked joint behind the hearth, she pressed furnace cement into a narrow gap and left it overnight. The following morning she rolled a single sheet of newspaper, placed dry splinters above it, and lit one corner. Smoke rose. For several seconds it wandered uncertainly beneath the throat. Then the chimney took it. The paper flame bent upward. Maeve added 2 thin pieces of wood, then 3. The drawer remained clean. An hour later she heated water in a blackened saucepan she had found beneath a bench and boiled it hard for 10 minutes. Into it she crumbled half a bouillon cube. Walter had slipped into her hardware bag without mentioning it, then added 2 broken crackers saved from the previous week. She ate sitting cross-legged beside the hearth. Steam warmed her face. The meal tasted mainly of salt and smoke. It was enough. That afternoon, with the front room swept and one corner made habitable, Maeve finally began examining the workroom as a shop rather than a ruin. She moved slowly. The huge apple butter kettle remained overturned near the centre. Against one wall leaned 3 copper sheets, dented but thick enough to save. A pair of long-jawed crimping tongs hung from a nail. Beneath a bench she found a wooden mallet with a mushroomed face, a soldering copper nearly as long as her forearm, and 2 iron stakes whose polished working surfaces had survived beneath grease. There was also a tinning brush hardened white at the bristles. Maeve touched it carefully. Elias had shown her one once. "Tin is not decoration," he had said while wiping a kettle interior bright. "Acid fruit does not care about nostalgia." At the far end of the room stood the hammering stump. She had noticed it the first day without understanding its importance. It was made from a section of white oak trunk nearly 3 feet across and a little higher than her knee, scarred by generations of hammer blows. Its upper surface had been hollowed into several shallow depressions used to support curved copper while raising or planishing it. Unlike the benches, it had not shifted. Maeve tried anyway. She braced both hands against the side and pushed. Nothing. She put one shoulder into it. The stump might have been rooted beneath the floor. Around its base lay copper clippings, mouse droppings, and a drift of old sawdust. She swept them away. One side sounded different when the broom handle struck it. Maeve stopped. She tapped again. Oak answered with a dense, short knock. She moved 6 inches left. Knock. Then right. A hollow note. Maeve set the broom down. She circled the stump, tapping every few inches. Most of the trunk gave the dead solidity of seasoned hardwood, but along the rear face, beginning about 8 inches above the floor, a patch roughly the width of 2 hands returned a lower sound. She knelt. The grain looked continuous. No hinge. No obvious seam. Maeve ran her fingertips over the surface. Something caught beneath her nail. A circle. Almost invisible beneath grime. She fetched a damp rag and wiped slowly until a thin round outline emerged in the oak. At its centre was a plug no larger than a penny. Maeve pressed it. Nothing. She tapped around the circle again. Hollow. She stood and tried lifting one side of the stump with an iron bar found near the hearth. It barely moved. Whatever was inside was not an empty mouse cavity. She returned to the circular outline. The disc had been cut across the grain and fitted so carefully that years of dust had hidden the edge. Near its lower rim, Maeve inserted the narrow tip of a screwdriver. The wood resisted. She stopped. Elias's voice came back with unwanted clarity. Never punish metal for refusing your first idea. Wood deserved the same courtesy. Maeve warmed the area with a damp cloth laid near the hearth. Not enough to swell it, only enough to loosen packed dirt. Then she traced the seam with the point of a nail. A line appeared. She worked around it twice. On the third pass, the disc shifted. Cedar. Not oak. A cedar disc had been stained to match the stump. Maeve eased it outward. Behind it was darkness. She fetched the matches but did not strike one near dry wood and old dust. Instead she carried the stump-side lantern she had borrowed from Walter, lit it at the hearth, and angled the beam through the opening. The hollow ran deep into the centre of the trunk. Something had been wrapped inside. Maeve sat back on her heels. For several minutes she did nothing. Then she reached in. The first package was long and narrow, wrapped in waxed canvas tied with linen cord. She placed it on the workbench. The second was heavier and wrapped in oilcloth. The third was a tin box. Maeve reached in once more and felt bare wood. She checked the cavity with her fingers. Empty. Only then did she begin opening what she had removed. The waxed canvas came first. Inside lay 4 coppersmith's hammers, a raising hammer with a narrow crosspeen, a planishing hammer polished nearly mirror-bright, a broad repoussé hammer, and a small finishing hammer whose ash handle had darkened where a hand had held it thousands of times. Maeve lifted the raising hammer. Stamped beneath the head were 2 letters. E.H. Her breath stopped. Elias Hollis. She lowered it onto the cloth. The second package contained copper, not scrap. Thin, carefully cut sample sheets separated by paper, each marked in pencil with temperatures, hammer sequences, and annealing intervals. Beneath them lay a black oilcloth notebook tied shut with red string. Maeve recognized it before touching it. The missing notebook from Elias's shop. She did not open it. Not yet. Beside it lay a small rectangle of copper engraved by hand. Each hammer blow does not deform you. It shapes what you can endure. Maeve read the sentence once, then turned the piece face down. The tin box remained. Its latch had been wired shut. She unwound the wire carefully, straightened it, and set it aside. Inside, bungeons of currency lay beneath a folded square of wool. Maeve stared. She closed the lid, opened it again. Nothing changed. She carried the box into the front room, locked the door, checked the back latch, and pulled the curtains over the least broken windows. Then she counted. Once, then twice. Bills came first, old and new issues mixed together, arranged by denomination and bound with paper bands that had gone brittle. Coins filled 4 cloth rolls and 2 small leather purses, silver Morgan dollars, peace dollars, walking liberty $half, Indian head cents darkened nearly brown. Maeve wrote every subtotal on the back of the county demolition notice. At the bottom, after recounting the bills for a third time, she added the figures. $27,900. Exactly. Under the final leather purse lay a small military medal wrapped in cotton. The ribbon had faded, but the bronze remained clear. A World War II victory medal. 145. Beneath it was an envelope. Maeve did not appear on the front. Neither did Elias. For the one who finds the hollow. Maeve held it by the edges. She knew the handwriting. The same narrow capitals had labelled jars of flux in Elias's shop. The same hand had written copper, Do not overheat across the top of an old pattern sheet when she was 11. Maeve placed the letter beside the notebook. Outside, evening had turned the windows blue. She could have opened it. Instead, she carried the money back to the cavity, wrapped it again, and replaced all but the notebook, the engraved copper piece, the medal, and the sealed envelope. Then she pushed the cedar disc loosely into place. She needed air. Maeve walked beyond the walnut trees to the drainage creek behind the property. Rain from earlier in the week had filled it enough to move over stones in a dark, steady sheet. She sat on the bank until the cold reached through her coat. $27,900 waited inside the stump. Enough money to leave. Enough money to eat. Enough money to sleep somewhere with heat and a locked door. Maeve watched one leaf turn slowly in an eddy before the current took it downstream. She did not spend $1. She did not open the letter. Not that night. Every hammer mark remembers the hand that made it. Morning came grey through the front windows. Maeve had slept badly, waking each time the forge settled around her. At sunrise she lit the hearth, warmed her hands, and set the unopened envelope on the workbench beneath the cleanest pane of glass. She knew Elias's handwriting before she broke the seal. The narrow, upright capitals leaned slightly forward, as though each word had somewhere practical to be. Maeve slid one finger beneath the flap. Inside were 4 folded pages. The paper smelled faintly of cedar. She opened them. My dear one, whoever you are, if you're reading this, then you found the hollow in the oak stump, which means you were patient enough to notice that one piece of wood did not answer like the rest. That is a good beginning. My name is Elias Patrick Hollis. In February of 2017, Dr. Miriam Keller at Lancaster General Hospital told me the cancer in my pancreas had spread to my liver. She was kind and exact. I asked how long. She said perhaps months, perhaps less. I did not ask her to make the answer prettier. There are things I should have settled years ago. Our family worked copper for 4 generations. Jeremiah Hollis began as a tinsmith's apprentice in Reading in 1869 and came to Lancaster County in 1878. His son Samuel, born in 1876, built large kettles for farm families from Littitz to Strasbourg. Samuel's daughter Ruth Hollis Mercer, born in 1902, learned to raise copper when most shops would not put a hammer in a woman's hand. My father, Thomas Hollis, born in 1924, kept the trade through the lean years after the war. I was the last one to make my living at it. This shop closed on October 14th, 1978. After that came more than 30 years of silence. My brother Daniel never came home from Vietnam. He was killed near Quang Tri in 1968. My father kept Daniel's medal wrapped in cotton because grief, in our family, was often stored inside practical containers. You will find it with the money. The money is not treasure. It is wages that were saved, tools that were sold, small payments never spent, and work that continued after people stopped believing the work mattered. Use it carefully. Do not let the amount persuade you that you are rich. Money kept too long can become as useless as a tool never lifted. The notebook belongs to the shop, not to me. There are methods in it, my father taught me, and methods Ruth improved. Read the pages before trusting the margins. Copper tells the truth faster than people do. For large kettle stock, do not begin raising after the metal work hardens. Anneal at a dull red, roughly 900 to 1000 degrees Fahrenheit in low light, then quench cleanly. Copper does not harden from quenching the way steel does. When cramping a seam, keep the folded teeth even and no deeper than the sheet can carry. 3 narrow bites hold better than 1 greedy one. For tinning, clean until water sheets across the copper without breaking. Use only enough flux to wet the surface. The tin should flow thin, not pool. Most important, alternate your hammering directions after each anneal. Do not chase the same line endlessly. Cross-working the surface, followed by careful planishing, gives stiffness without inviting a crack along one tired path. That method saved many kettles. It also saved me from becoming a man who believed force was the same thing as skill. Inheritance is not what somebody hides for you. It is what remains usable after they are gone. A hammer with a dressed face, a measurement written clearly, a seam that does not leak when the fruit begins boiling, a door repaired by someone who knows another person will someday need to walk through it. I do not know who you are. Perhaps you are family. Perhaps you're not. If you found this place because you were desperate, I'm sorry for whatever brought you here. Desperation has a way of making any roof look like mercy. Do not mistake mercy for debt. You owe the dead nothing except honest attention. Learn what is useful. Leave what is not. If you choose to work copper, start small. Make failures you can afford. Listen to the sound beneath the hammer when the note changes. Stop before pride teaches the lesson expensively. If you choose another life, that is also allowed. Behind the shop, past the walnut nearest the creek, there is an old stone marker almost level with the ground. Ruth set it there. You will know it by the small crossed hammer mark. Light her brass hand lamp once. She would have liked that. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. March 2017. Maeve read the letter twice. The second time, she slowed over the places where Elias had pressed the pen harder. Daniel's name, the date the shop closed, the sentence about desperation. Then she folded the pages along their original creases, not new ones. The old folds had already decided where the paper wanted to bend. She placed the letter inside its envelope and carried it through the back door. Morning rain had stopped. The ground beneath the walnut trees was black with moisture, and every step released, the smell of leaves turning slowly into earth. Maeve walked toward the creek, counting trees until she reached the one whose trunk divided low into two heavy arms. Beyond it, weeds covered a slight rise. She pushed them aside with her boot. Stone appeared. The marker lay almost flat with the soil. No larger than a serving tray, its edges softened by weather. Maeve knelt and scraped moss away with the side of her hand. Two small hammers had been carved into the stone, crossed at the handles. No name. No date. Only the mark. Maeve rested her palm against it. Then she went back inside. The brass hand lamp stood on a high shelf in the workroom, blackened almost beyond recognition. She had assumed it was another piece of scrap. Now she brought it down. Its reservoir still opened. She cleaned the burner threads with a rag, trimmed the stiff wick, and added a little lamp oil Walter had included among a bundle of household odds and ends the day before. The first match failed. The second caught. A small yellow flame rose beneath the soot-stained chimney. Maeve set the lamp on the hammering stump. Its light touched the raising hammers, the green copper sheets, and the enormous overturned kettle. Nothing else happened. Nothing needed to. She sat beside it until the oil warmed the brass. That afternoon she noticed how many small acts had already carried her farther than $5 should have allowed. Ruth from the bakery had placed stale rolls in a paper bag instead of throwing them away. The unnamed bus driver had looked once at Maeve's coins, closed his hand around the fare box, and said, "Sit near the heater." Mrs. Wentz had stamped the deed without making poverty feel like foolishness. Walter Miller had opened a ledger to a 19-year-old stranger with $1.12 in her pocket and written her name as though he expected her to remain long enough to repay him. None of them had rescued her. That was what made the kindnesses durable. They had simply moved one obstacle aside. There is probably a small kindness someone once gave you that they may not even remember now. A meal left quietly, a ride when you had no way home, a door held open at the right hour. What was yours? Maeve did not answer aloud. That night she wrapped Elias's 4 hammers in the waxed canvas again and placed them beside her bedding. The notebook went beneath her backpack. The letter stayed under Patrick's flannel shirt. Before sleeping. She looked once toward the workroom, where Ruth's brass lamp had gone dark but remained warm enough to hold the memory of flame. The first snow came on December 3. 4 inches settled over the walnut roots and outlined every weakness in the roof. Meltwater found the rear workroom before noon, dripping through one seam in the slate and darkening the floor beside the copper sheets. Maeve read the roofing chapter of Walter's repair manual 3 times. Then she measured. The main roof planes totaled just under 1,200 square feet. Allowing for waste, she calculated 13 squares of replacement shingles, 2 rolls of felt, and enough roofing nails to cover the south slope first, where the leak was worst. Walter looked over her figures at the counter. Maeve added it. He nodded once and reached beneath a shelf. The roofing hatchet he handed her had a leather-wrapped grip, polished nearly black. "My brother's," he said. "He won't need it." Maeve began to refuse. Walter pushed it closer. A man named Abram Lapp appeared at the forge the next morning, carrying a folding rule and no introduction. He was 71. Narrow as a fence rail, with one ear permanently reddened by weather. For 40 years he had roofed barns, farmhouses, schools, and churches Maeve told him she could not pay. They worked 11 days. Abram showed her how to sister a split rafter with dry lumber, long enough to bridge sound wood on both sides. Then bolt through, rather than trust old nails. He snapped a chalk line across the first course and made Maeve reset it when she allowed the line to drift. On the 3rd morning he watched her drive a nail. Maeve looked at it. She did. He taught her 3 strokes: set, drive, finish. Not 4. Not 7. A roofing nail struck too often lost more than time. Every extra blow increased the chance of bruising the shingle beneath. By mid-December the south slope lay tight and straight. On the final afternoon, Maeve climbed down the ladder and stood in the yard while a light sleet touched the new roof. No drip sounded inside. That silence was the first thing she trusted. January exposed what the first fire had hidden. Several chimney bricks above the roofline had begun spalling, their faces flaking away in thin red shells. When Maeve scraped one mortar joint with a screwdriver, the material fell out as powder. Abram would not let her ignore it. Walter ordered hydraulic lime and fireclay. Maeve mixed them at roughly 3 parts lime mortar to 1 part fireclay for the heat-affected joints, working only small batches so nothing stiffened before she placed it. She raked loose mortar to sound depth, dampened the old brick, packed each joint firmly, and protected the fresh work beneath canvas whenever the temperature threatened to drop too quickly. The work took 3 weeks. Most mornings stayed in the 20s Fahrenheit. Gloves made the pointing clumsy, so Maeve often removed them for the final shaping. Her bare fingers went numb about every 15 minutes. She would climb down, warm both hands around a mug beside the hearth, then return before comfort had time to become persuasion. One cracked brick had to be cut out completely. Another broke as she removed it. Maeve stared at the pieces in the snow. Abram handed her the chisel. In late January, After the mortar had cured enough for a cautious test, Maeve built a small fire. Paper first, then kindling, then one split of dry oak. She stepped outside. Smoke rose from the rebuilt crown in a narrow grey column and cleared the roof without curling back. Inside, the flame drew clean. Maeve held her hand near the repaired joint. No smoke. No heat where there should not be heat. She added one more piece of wood. The floors revealed themselves only after the roof stopped leaking. Beneath soot and blackened finish were white pine planks, wide and uneven, fastened in places with hand-cut rose-head nails whose faceted heads still caught light at an angle. Maeve refused to replace them. She rented a random orbit sander for $14 a day and carried it home in a borrowed wagon. The first pass was 80 grit. Dust filled the room until her eyelashes turned pale. The second pass, 120 grit, erased the coarser scratches and brought out grain that had been hidden for decades. The third, 220. She did more slowly than necessary. Along the walls she sanded by hand to avoid thinning the board edges. Each rosehead nail was set only where it stood proud enough to catch paper. Then came oil, 3 coats. She wiped the first into the pine with old cotton, let it penetrate, then removed everything the wood refused to absorb. The second coat deepened the grain. The third brought the boards from dull dark honey toward mahogany, where age and heat had darkened them nearest the hearth. She gave the final coat a full 48-hour cure. One morning between coats, nothing worked. Maeve woke tired before she moved. She opened the manual and read the same paragraph 4 times. A tin cup slipped from her hand. When she tried fitting a loose threshold strip, she cut it short. She put the saw down. At the marsh beyond the creek, a great blue heron stood in 6 inches of winter water. Maeve watched it for nearly an hour. The bird did almost nothing. Once it lifted 1 foot and placed it down again. Maeve spent the rest of that day beside the marsh and did no work at all. The next morning, she recut the threshold correctly. When the floors had cured, she walked across them in clean socks. For the first time, the rooms reflected light upward. There were 8 windows. 3 had no glass at all. 4 held cracked panes repaired with old tape, putty, or wishful thinking. The 8th contained 1 original pane, its surface wavering enough to bend the walnut branches outside. A scratched date in the sash read 1788. Maeve preserved that one exactly as it was. Walter found salvaged glass close enough in thickness for the others. Maeve removed the old glazing with patient heat rather than force, cleaned each rabbet, laid a thin bed of DAP 33 glazing putty, then pressed the glass gently until the compound seated evenly beneath the edge. Glazier's points came next, then the face putty, drawn smooth with a knife held at a low angle, so the bevel shed water without rising above the sight line from inside. 2 sash cords had rotted through. Maeve replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton cord, feeding each line over the pulley and tying a figure-8 knot where it entered the counterweight. The first sash slammed shut. She had misjudged the balance. The second held. By the 8th window, her hands understood the work before the manual could explain it again. She preserved the old 1788 pane in place, cleaning only the loose dirt and leaving every bubble and wavering line untouched. Outside, February sunlight lay thin across the snow. Maeve fitted the final strip of putty. A chickadee landed on a walnut branch less than 6 feet from the glass. It tilted its head once. Maeve stopped moving. The bird remained there for several seconds, small and round against the bare wood, then vanished toward the creek. Maeve looked through the restored pane. The branch remained sharp. The room behind her was warmer. The plaster failed 3 times beside the chimney. Each patch looked sound while wet, then cracked along the edge by morning. The original walls had been built over hand-split oak lath, and the surviving plaster still carried coarse horsehair through its body. Modern patching compound dried too hard against it. Walter brought Maeve an old feed sack. Inside was clean horsehair, grey and brown, tied in loose bundles. Maeve mixed lime plaster slowly, teasing the hair through it until the fibres dispersed instead of clumping. The first coat went on as a scored scratch coat, pressed between the oak laths and combed while still green. The brown coat followed at roughly 3/8 of an inch. She left it 72 hours, then came the finish coat, only about 1/8 inch, worked smooth with a damp trowel. Maeve stood back from the repaired chimney wall. She did not say it proudly. She said it like a measurement. The paper bags began appearing before sunrise. Doris Keane, owner of the Dutch Pantry Cafe, had red reading glasses attached to a silver chain and a habit of folding the tops of bags twice. Bread ends, soup in jars, 2 boiled eggs, once a square of choufle pie. Maeve carried money to the cafe after selling a small load of salvaged scrap. Doris pushed it back. In Candles, when the shop reopens, Maeve started to explain that no shop was reopening. Doris had already turned toward the grill. A week later, a bicycle came rattling down the lane. The boy riding it could not have been older than 16. His knees rose too high because the Schwinn frame was small for him, and a splitting maul lay tied across the rear rack with clothesline. He stopped beneath the walnuts. Maeve looked at the maul. My mother said, "About your grandfather." Elias had not been her grandfather, but Maeve did not correct him. Caleb spent the afternoon splitting the fallen ash behind the forge into stove lengths. When Maeve offered him $2, he shook his head hard enough to move the hair off his forehead. The next morning he returned with 3 wedges. Reverend Boyd did less and somehow became just as familiar. He walked past the forge every morning at 7:10, wearing the same dark wool coat and polished shoes inappropriate for muddy shoulders. His moustache was white and clipped square beneath his nose. For weeks he only tipped his hat. Then, one morning after ice coated the lane, he stopped beside the gate. Steady hands, sound roof. Amen. 4 words before the amen. After that, he continued walking. Maeve found the prayer useful. She postponed the cellar until February 11th. The stone steps had looked unsafe from the beginning, and every sensible task above ground seemed more urgent. There were 7 granite steps. Below them lay a 12 by 15-foot cellar with a fieldstone floor, low joists, and 1 narrow vent clogged with leaves. Near the centre stood a dressed granite slab, unlike the rough stones around it. Maeve swept it clean. The same crossed hammer mark from Ruth's outdoor marker had been carved near one corner. She did not lift the slab. Some questions deserved to survive one more season. While clearing beneath the stairs, Maeve found a small oak box wedged behind the 3rd step. Inside lay a brass key. Its bow had been shaped into 2 crossed coppersmith's hammers. Beneath it was a tintype wrapped in cloth. The photograph showed a young woman standing outside the forge in summer, bone hand resting on a large raising hammer. Her dress was dark, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. Maeve stared at the face. Not similar. The same. The brow. The long mouth. Even the slight unevenness in the eyes. On the back, written in faded ink, Ruth Hollis, daughter of Samuel, age 25. Summer of 1903. Maeve carried the key upstairs and placed it on the mantel. She tried it in no lock. For now, not knowing what it opened felt honest. Snow retreated first from the south wall, then from the lane. By March, the creak behind the forge ran loud enough to hear from the workroom, and pale walnut catkins began hanging from the branches like small green ropes. Maeve opened Elias's notebook each morning. She still did not begin a kettle. Not that spring. Large copper was too expensive, and knowledge inherited too quickly could become another kind of waste. She chose one old coin from the cache to sell for materials. Only one. With the proceeds, she bought small copper sheets and practiced on samples no larger than dinner plates, annealing, raising, crossing hammer directions, stopping when the sound hardened beneath the tool. Most pieces failed. She kept them all. The house was patient. So was she? 2 winters later, in December 2024, Maeve finished her first complete copper apple butter kettle. Not 50 gallons, 22. Large enough to matter. Small enough that every mistake remained within the reach of 2 hands. She had cut the copper in sections, cramped the seams evenly, brazed them closed, and annealed the body repeatedly as the walls rose beneath thousands of hammer blows. Each cycle changed the sound. At first, copper answered softly. As it work hardened, the note sharpened. Maeve stopped before the metal asked twice. After the final planishing, she cleaned the interior until rinse water sheeted without breaking, fluxed it sparingly, then wiped a thin coat of tin across the copper. No pools. No bare patches. When the kettle cooled, Maeve filled it with water. Nothing leaked. She left it overnight anyway. In the morning the floor beneath remained dry. The forge itself no longer looked restored so much as inhabited. White pine floors carried dark paths where Maeve walked most often. The repaired plaster had dried pale around the chimney. Ruth's lamp stood on the mantel beside the unknown brass key. Elias's hammers hung above the main bench, not polished for display but dressed, oiled, and used. The old 50-gallon kettle remained in the corner. Maeve had not repaired it. Not everything old needed to become useful immediately. The key waited another 6 months. In June, Caleb came to help cut back dead growth near the oldest walnut. He struck something with the end of his rake. Metal answered beneath bark. Maeve knelt. A small brass plate had been fitted into the tree long ago and nearly swallowed by growth. Only one edge remained visible. At its centre was a keyhole. Maeve went inside. The crossed hammer key turned once. A narrow compartment opened behind the plate. Inside was a packet wrapped in oilcloth. The first object was a folded 48-star American flag, small enough to have been carried rather than flown. The second was a letter. Ruth Hollis had written it in October 1918, while the First World War still consumed Europe and influenza moved through Pennsylvania towns faster than funeral wagons could answer. She wrote about her younger brother, Samuel Jr., serving with the American Expeditionary Forces in France. She wrote that their mother listened for wagon wheels at night because official telegrams came by road. She wrote that the forge continued because kettles still split, gutters still failed, and families still needed vessels to preserve food. Work is not proof that nothing hurts. Sometimes work is only the place where your hands remain useful while you are waiting. Samuel Jr. survived the war. Daniel did not survive his. Maeve finally understood why the medal in the stump had been stored with the family papers instead of displayed. On May 30th, 2025, she carried Daniel Hollis's 1945 era family medal and the later records Elias had kept to Indiantown Gap National Cemetery, where Daniel's name was documented with his generations dead. She did not leave the medal there. She stood quietly on Memorial Day, held it in her palm, then brought it home. Objects could honor the dead without being surrendered to them. The money remained mostly untouched. Maeve sold 3 collectible coins during the first winter. 1 paid for roof materials not covered by salvage. 1 paid for copper sheet and tin. 1 covered the well testing, pump work, and a modest used stove after the old one finally cracked beyond repair. A 4th coin was sold the following year to repair the forge's electrical service safely. That was all. The remaining bills and coins went back into the oak stump inside new archival envelopes and sealed metal boxes. Maeve added a ledger. 4, the next one. Below it, she recorded every dollar removed and why. No secret stayed pure by becoming impossible to use. No inheritance stayed honorable by becoming an excuse. The shop reopened without a sign, advertisement, or ceremony. Doris handled it first. One morning Maeve entered the cafe and found an index card pinned to the corkboard beside notices for quilting help and firewood delivery. Hollis Copper Repairs. Kettles, pans, small work. IS key Doris. Maeve looked toward the counter. Doris was pouring coffee. "You forgot candles," Maeve said. Doris pointed toward a cardboard box beneath the register. Maeve laughed. By autumn, more than 40 names had been written onto a mailing list kept in a flour-stained notebook at the cafe. Most people wanted repairs. A loose handle, a leaking seam. A kettle that had belonged to somebody's grandmother and had not held apple butter in 30 years. Maeve accepted only the work she understood. Everything else waited. Caleb was 18 when he arrived one Saturday carrying a wooden sign beneath one arm. He had grown into the Schwinn, though he still rode it with the seat too low. The sign was black walnut. Beneath it, on a smaller board, he had added, "Daughters." Maeve ran her thumb across the carving. Caleb leaned the sign against the bench. Neither did the sign. Maeve looked again. The words were not a prediction. They were room. Ruth had stood at the forge when shops did not easily put hammers in women's hands. Maeve had returned without knowing Ruth's face. Whoever came next might arrive for reasons no one could anticipate. They hung the sign beneath the eaves. The older lettering remained above it, faded and incomplete. Maeve did not remove that either. In January 2026, she began writing her own letter. She used Elias's bench. Ruth's lamp burned beside her. The first line came easily. "My dear one, whoever you are." After that, Maeve stopped. She did not know what instructions mattered yet. A person should not write an inheritance merely because they had survived long enough to own paper. So she wrote only what she could prove. How to listen for work-hardened copper. How to test tinning by the way water moved across the surface. Where the main shut-off valve was. Which roof slope iced first. That Walter Miller's account had been paid. That Doris preferred candle payments only when she was being impossible. Then Maeve wrote about the money. Not the amount. The purpose. Use what preserves the work. Leave enough for someone whose worst day has not happened yet. She folded the unfinished pages and placed them in the tin box. There would be time to add more. On autumn evenings, the forge changed colour before dark. Low sun entered through the restored windows, bent through the old 1788 glass, and crossed the hammering stump in wavering bands. Some evenings Maeve worked, some she did not. There was no virtue in striking copper merely because a hammer was nearby. She learned to stop when her hands became inaccurate. She learned that patience was not passive. It had weight, temperature, timing. A seam either held or it did not. Every hammer mark remembers the hand that made it. One October night, apple butter simmered in Maeve's 22-gallon kettle behind the forge. Doris stirred for 20 minutes and complained for 19. Caleb fed the fire. Walter sat on an overturned bucket and corrected everyone's technique, whether invited or not. Maeve stood beneath the walnut branches and listened to the wooden paddle scrape slowly across tinned copper. The sound was ordinary. That was why it mattered. No crowd came. No newspaper recorded it. By midnight, jars cooled on a long table while steam dampened the windows. Inside the workroom, Elias's letter rested in its envelope. Ruth's photograph remained beneath glass. Daniel's medal lay wrapped again in cotton. The brass key hung on a small nail near the mantel. The great kettle waited unrepaired in the corner. Some things had waited nearly half a century already. Copper, apple butter, kettle forge waits. It has always waited, and in the county records office. Mrs. Eleanor Wentz still kept one small relic of the original transfer. When the accounting month closed years earlier, she had exchanged Maeve's $5 bill with one of her own before the deposit went to the county. Patrick's folded bill remained in the back of her desk drawer. The crease still crossed Washington's face. Mrs. Wentz never spent it.